The first time Belle Holloway heard the name Luke Alden, it came wrapped in a warning, delivered across a saloon bar by a woman with knowing eyes and a voice worn thin by hard years. Belle had arrived in Dustcreek, Nevada on a Tuesday afternoon in the spring of 1882, stepping off the stagecoach with a leather satchel, a second-hand Winchester rifle, and a reputation for being difficult that had followed her all the way from Abilene, Kansas. She was 24 years old, sharp-tongued and sharp-eyed, with dark auburn hair that caught the last light of late afternoon, and a jaw set in the particular way of a woman who had learned that the world did not give you anything unless you demanded it with both hands. Dustcreek was a mining town doing its best to grow up into something respectable and mostly failing. There was a general store, a telegraph office, a livery stable that smelled exactly as you would expect, two competing churches whose pastors reportedly did not speak to each other, and 4 saloons. Belle had come because her late father's land deed, which she had carried folded inside her left boot for 3 weeks, said she owned 40 acres of scrub land on the western edge of town, and she intended to do something with those 40 acres if it killed her. The saloon she walked into first was called the Red Spur, and it was the kind of place that went quiet when a woman entered alone. Belle let the quiet sit for a moment, the way she always did, long enough to make it uncomfortable for everyone else, and then she walked to the bar and asked for a glass of water and directions to the land registry office. The woman behind the bar was named Rosa Gutierrez, and she had been pouring drinks in Dustcreek for 11 years and had seen enough to fill several books. She was somewhere in her mid-40s, compact and deliberate in her movements, with silver threading through her black hair. She looked at Belle for a long moment the way experienced people look at newcomers, measuring what they are made of, and then she poured the water and set it on the bar with a small, solid thud. "Registry office closes at 4, Rosa said. "You missed it by 30 minutes. You planning on staying in town?" "Long as it takes," Belle said. Rosa studied her again. "You got a name?" "Belle Holloway." Something moved across Rosa's face. Not surprise exactly, but recognition of a kind. "Holloway, you Elias Holloway's girl." "His daughter," Belle confirmed. "He left me some land in the deed, and I mean to claim it." Rosa leaned one elbow on the bar and lowered her voice, though there was no real need since the men around them had gone back to their card games and their conversations. "Your daddy's land is in a disputed area," she said. "There's a man named Harlan Cross who has been pushing claims on the western edge for 2 years. He has lawyers and he has money, and he has people who do things for him when lawyers and money aren't quite enough." "I have a Winchester and a clear deed," Belle said, and she took a long drink of water. Rosa smiled then, a small, complicated smile. "Well, you'll need more than that, probably." She paused. "You heard of Luke Alden?" Belle shook her head. "He runs cattle east of town," Rosa said. "Has done for 6 years. The best horseman in 3 counties and probably the most stubborn man between here and the California coast. He knows this land better than anyone. He also knows Harlan Cross better than most, having had dealings with him over water rights last summer." She stopped again and looked at Belle directly. "He would be useful to you." "But," Belle said, because there was clearly a but. Rosa straightened up and picked up a glass to polish. "He is the kind of man who ruins women," she said simply. "I have seen it twice. Good women, sensible women, who let themselves get tangled up with Luke Alden and came out the other side changed in ways that did not serve them well. He doesn't do it on purpose, I don't think. But he's charming and he's beautiful to look at, and he keeps just enough of himself back that a woman always feels like she's reaching for something she can't quite hold. And that reaching does something to a person." Belle was quiet for a moment. The saloon noise moved around them, the clink of glasses and the low rumble of men's voices, and somewhere in the back a piano being played badly. "Is he honest?" she asked. "As the day is long," Rosa said. "Is he capable?" "Extraordinarily." "Does he have a reason to help me?" "He has reason to want Harlan Cross stopped," Rosa said. "Whether that translates to helping you is another matter." Belle set down her glass and picked up her satchel. Where do I find him?" Rosa looked at her with something that might have been amusement and something that might have been pity. "East Road, about 4 miles. Ranch is called the Broken Creek." Belle nodded and turned to leave. "Miss Holloway," Rosa called after her. She turned back. Rosa's expression had settled into something serious and genuinely warm. "I told you what he does to women. I mean that as a caution." "I appreciate it," Belle said. "I mean to ruin him first." She walked out into the gold and dusty afternoon light and did not look back. She did not go to the Broken Creek that evening. She found lodging at the town's only boarding house, a 2-story affair run by a widow named Mrs. Pratt who had rules about mealtimes and mud on boots. And she slept on a mattress that was neither soft nor hard enough but was horizontal, which was an improvement on 3 weeks of stagecoach benches. In the morning she was at the registry office when it opened and spent 2 hours with the registrar, a nervous balding man named Mr. Fitch, going over her father's deed. The deed was solid. Elias Holloway had purchased 42 acres in 1871, paid for in full, and the land was hers by right of inheritance. The complication, as Mr. Fitch explained in the voice of a man who wished he were somewhere else, was that Harlan Cross had filed a competing claim in 1880 on the grounds that the land had been abandoned and was therefore subject to homestead reclassification. He had paid a lawyer named Beaumont to argue that Elias Holloway had not made sufficient improvements to the land to maintain his claim. "Has anyone ruled on this?" Belle asked. "It is pending with the Territorial Land Court," Mr. Fitch said. "There is a hearing scheduled for the 14th of June. She did the calculation. That was 6 weeks away. "Who is the judge?" she asked. "Judge Harlan Cross appointed the hearing officer," Mr. Fitch said, and then immediately corrected himself with the look of a man who has said something he should not have. "I mean to say, the hearing officer was appointed through the normal process, and Harlan Cross is, separately, a member of the town council which has advisory." "Thank you, Mr. Fitch," Belle said. "That tells me everything I need to know." She walked out of the registry office into a morning that had already gone warm. The Nevada sky above Dustcreek, the particular flat blue of high desert, and stood in the street for a moment with the deed in her hand and 6 weeks, and a corrupt land process between her and what was rightfully hers. She needed Luke Alden. She did not particularly want to need anyone, but she was practical enough to know the difference between pride and survival, and she tucked the deed back into her satchel and went to the livery to hire a horse. The east road out of Dustcreek was unpaved and ran through scrubland that was trying very hard to become something more dramatic and not quite getting there. Low sage and scattered juniper and red rock outcroppings that caught the morning light beautifully. Belle was a competent rider, not elegant, but competent, and she followed the road for 4 miles until she saw a split-rail fence running alongside a creek bed, and beyond it a ranch house that was modest in size but so well kept it was almost startling against the rough landscape. The Broken Creek Ranch was not large by the standards of the Nevada cattle operations she had read about, but it was obviously loved. The house was painted white, unusual in this country. The yard was clear, and the outbuildings were in good repair, and there were horses in the corral that were, even to her untrained eye, exceptional animals. She dismounted at the gate and tied her horse to the post and walked toward the house, and it was then that she saw him. He was on the fence of the corral with a rope in his hands, and he was working a young bay horse through a slow, patient circle, his attention so complete that he had not yet registered she was there. Belle stopped walking and just looked at him for a moment, which she told herself was simply information gathering. He was tall and lean with the particular economy of movement that comes from a life spent doing physical work that matters. His hair was dark, nearly black, and he wore it a little long under his hat. He was, as Rosa had said, beautiful to look at, though beautiful was not quite the right word, or rather it was only part of the right description. He had the kind of face that was better than handsome because it was more interesting than handsome, a face that had been tested by weather and difficulty, and had come through it with lines that told you something real. He was, she guessed, around 28 or 29. Old enough to know better, she thought, about whatever it was that Rosa had warned her about. But that was a problem for later. He saw her then. He did not startle. He just went still for a moment, looking at her with gray eyes that had the same quality of complete attention he had been giving the horse. Then he coiled the rope in one hand and came to the fence, and stepped through the rails with the easy, unhurried grace of a man who had done that 10,000 times. "Morning," he said. His voice was low, unhurried, with the faint erosion of accent that said he had been born somewhere with harder vowels and had spent years softening them. "Morning," she said. "I'm looking for Luke Alden." "You found him," he said. He looked at her with frank but polite curiosity. "I don't believe we've met." "We haven't," she said. "My name is Belle Holloway. I arrived in Dustcreek yesterday. My father was Elias Holloway." Something shifted in his expression. It was not pity exactly. It was the recognition of a situation he understood. "I heard Elias passed last winter," he said. "I'm sorry for your loss." "Thank you," she said, and meant it, though she kept her voice businesslike. "He left me his land claim, and Harlan Cross is trying to take it through a land court that Cross has effectively hand-picked. I have a hearing in 6 weeks, and I need someone who knows this territory and knows Cross's methods. Rosa Gutierrez said you might have reason to help." He was quiet for a moment, looking at her steadily. She held his gaze without difficulty because she had spent 24 years practicing not looking away from things. "Rosa sent you," he said. There was a slight something in his voice when he said Rosa's name, something fond and wry that suggested history between them. "She told me you were the best option available," Belle said. "She also told me you were the kind of man who ruins women." She watched his face carefully. "I thought you should know that I know that." For a long moment he looked at her, and she could not quite read what moved through his expression, whether it was surprise or amusement or something more complicated than either. "She's not wrong," he said finally, and his voice was very quiet without defensiveness. "About the second part." "Good," Belle said. "Then we understand each other." "Do we?" he said. "I'm not here to be understood that way," she said plainly. "I'm here because I need help and you're the most useful person for the job. I'll pay fairly for your time and your knowledge. I have no interest in anything else." He studied her for another long moment, and she thought she saw something in his face that might have been respect or might have been something more interesting than respect. "Come inside," he said. "I'll make coffee." The inside of the Broken Creek house was as well maintained as the outside, which surprised her mildly. She had expected a bachelor's disorder and found instead clean floors and neat shelves, and a kitchen that showed evidence of someone who cooked real meals rather than just heating beans over a fire. There were books, which she noticed. A shelf of them beside the fireplace, genuine books, worn with reading. He made coffee on the stove and brought 2 cups to the kitchen table and sat across from her, and she laid out the whole situation. The deed, the competing claim, the hearing in 6 weeks, the hearing officer appointed under Cross's influence, the lawyer Beaumont. Luke listened without interrupting. He held his coffee cup in both hands and looked at the table while she talked, and she could see him thinking, not in the anxious, fidgeting way of some men, but in the still focused way of someone who was genuinely processing what they were being told. "Cross filed that competing claim 2 months after your father got sick," Luke said, when she finished. "I know because I heard about it the same time he was coming after my water rights. He files against people who are weak or absent. It's how he operates." His jaw tightened slightly. "He nearly got my Upper Creek in August. I had to go to the territorial court in Carson City to stop it." "So you know how to fight him legally," she said. "I know a lawyer in Carson City who is honest," Luke said. "His name is James Ockafer. He is not cheap, but he is thorough and he does not work both sides." He paused. "Beaumont does. Cross pays him a retainer, but Beaumont will take cases against Cross too if someone else pays more. That's the first thing you should know." Belle filed that away. "What do I need to prove at the hearing?" "That your father maintained the claim," he said. You need evidence of ongoing use or intent to use, and you need to demonstrate continuous ownership. Do you have correspondence, tax records? Anything showing Elias engaging with the land after he purchased it, she thought. He went out there twice that I know of. He wrote me letters mentioning it. I might have those letters. Get them, Luke said. Everyone you can find. She looked at him across the table. The morning light came through the kitchen window and fell across the side of his face, and she thought, not for the first time in the past 20 minutes, that Rosa had been accurate about the beautiful to look at part. She set the thought aside with the practiced firmness of a woman who had set a great many thoughts aside over the years. You haven't said whether you'll help me, she said. He looked up at her directly. His gray eyes were clear and steady. I'll help you, he said. Cross has had it his way in this county too long, and your father was a decent man. He bought that land fair. How did you know him? She asked, surprised. Met him twice, Luke said. He came out to see the land in '74 and again in '78. I helped him fix a fence post the second time. We talked for an hour. He paused. He talked about you. Belle was not prepared for that. She felt it somewhere under her ribs, the unexpected warmth of her father having spoken about her to this stranger in the middle of the Nevada scrub, and she pressed her hands flat on the table and breathed through it. What did he say? She asked, and her voice was steady. That you were the most stubborn person he had ever met, Luke said, and that you were going to do something remarkable with your life. She looked at the table for a moment. He was right about the first part, she said. Maybe about both, Luke said quietly. She looked up at him then, and their eyes held for a second too long, and she looked away first, which annoyed her faintly. When can you meet with me again? She said, back to business. I need to review what Cross has filed, talk to the other people he has pushed claims against, and write to Carson City about Mr. Acaffer. He sat back in his chair. I have a cattle drive to the northern pasture Thursday and Friday. Monday I'm free. Come back Monday. I'll be at the registry office every day until then, she said, pulling every document Cross has filed. She stood and picked up her satchel. Thank you for the coffee. He walked her out to her horse. She mounted and gathered the reins and looked down at him, the morning sun behind her now. Why did Rosa warn me about you? She asked. It was a direct question, and she knew it, but she wanted the direct answer. He looked up at her from under the brim of his hat, and his expression was honest and a little uncomfortable, which she appreciated. Because I have not been careful with people who cared for me, he said, and she saw it happen, and she did not want to see it happen again. She looked at him for a moment. Honest answer, she said. You asked an honest question. She turned her horse toward the east road. Monday, she said, and rode back toward Dustcreek without looking back. She spent Thursday and Friday at the registry office with Mr. Fitch, who had apparently decided that she was there to stay and had become marginally more cooperative, pulling documents related to the Cross land claims. She made notes in a small leather notebook and built a picture that was even more troubling than she had expected. Over the preceding 4 years, Harlan Cross had filed competing claims against 6 landowners in the western edge of Dustcreek. 2 had settled for pennies on the dollar and moved on. 2 were still in dispute. 1 had simply vanished, which was the one that made the hair rise on the back of her neck. On Saturday, she wrote a long letter to her mother in Abilene, asking for any correspondence from her father related to the Dustcreek land, and a shorter letter to the Territorial Land Court Office in Carson City, requesting information about the hearing and the officer assigned to it. She sent the letter to the address Luke had given her for James Acaffer, introducing herself and explaining the situation. On Sunday, she went to one of the 2 churches, the one with the quieter pastor, and sat in the back and thought about her father, which was something she had not let herself do properly since he died. He had been a quiet man, Elias Holloway, bookish and impractical in some ways, but he had believed in things and he had passed that on to her. He had believed in her, which had been the most useful inheritance. She walked back from church through the main street of Dustcreek and got her first proper look at Harlan Cross. He was coming out of the land office on the opposite side of the street. a broad-shouldered man in his late 40s, with a florid face and expensive clothes that announced wealth rather than suggesting it. He was accompanied by two other men, one of whom was a young lawyer-type Belle assumed was Beaumont, the other a rangy, silent figure who had the particular stillness of a man paid to be present rather than to contribute. Cross saw her looking at him and looked back with the incurious assessment of a powerful man encountering someone he did not know and did not consider important. Then he went on his way, and Belle stood on the wooden sidewalk and watched him go and felt something cold and clear settle in her chest. She was going to win this. Monday came and she rode out to the Broken Creek in the early morning. Luke was already working when she arrived, doing something with fence rails, and he called to her to come to the barn where there was a table he used for paperwork. She spread out her notes and he looked through them with focused, quiet attention. "He's running the same pattern every time," she said, pointing to the timeline she had mapped. "He waits until an owner is absent or weakened, files immediately, and then uses the delay in the court process to establish what looks like continuous presence." "That's exactly right," Luke said. He leaned over the table beside her, close enough that she was aware of him in a physical way she would have preferred not to be, the warmth of him and the particular outdoors smell of sun and leather and something clean. She moved her attention firmly back to the documents. "The other two in dispute, the Garza family and old Pete Merritt, they have similar situations to yours. Pete's in bad health and Clara Garza is dealing with it alone because her husband is working the mines." "What if we present all three cases together?" Belle said. "Not legally, but publicly. If we can get the whole picture in front of the territorial judge rather than just this local hearing officer, we'd need a way to get it there," he said. "The territorial court doesn't automatically review local hearings. We'd need to petition for oversight." "Can Acafer do that, if the grounds are strong enough?" He straightened up and looked at her. "You've been busy." "I don't know how to be any other way," she said. He looked at her for a moment with that steady gray gaze. "No," he said thoughtfully, "I don't imagine you do." She did not know exactly what he meant by that, whether it was admiration or something more ambivalent, and she chose not to ask. Over the next 2 weeks they met 3 times at the Broken Creek and twice in Dustcreek at the small back table of Rose's saloon, which had the advantage of being private and the slight disadvantage of Rosa watching them with an expression of someone observing something she had predicted. Belle had begun to find Rosa's knowing looks more amusing than annoying. They were becoming, in the quiet, gradual way of women who respect each other, something that might turn into friendship. The letter from James Acafer in Carson City arrived 10 days after she sent hers. He was brief and precise and clearly intelligent. He agreed that the pattern she had described was worth pursuing, that a petition for territorial oversight was legally viable if they could demonstrate coordinated fraud, and that he would take the case for a fee she could meet if she was careful. He would need sworn statements from the other claimants. Belle went to see Clara Garza and Pete Merritt herself. Clara was a compact woman with 2 children underfoot, and the particular exhausted determination of someone fighting on multiple fronts, and she looked at Belle across her kitchen table and said, "I have been praying for someone to come along and do exactly this." Pete Merritt was 70, slow-moving, sharp-minded, and gratifyingly furious about what Cross had done. He signed the statement without reading it first and then read it afterwards, and said it was accurate. Luke drove her to the Garza farm in his wagon because the road was not good for a single rider with documents to carry, and on the way back in the late afternoon, he asked her about Abilene and she told him about growing up there, her father's bookshop, the way Kansas smelled in the spring. He listened the way he did everything with that full quiet attention, and it did something uncomfortable to her equilibrium. "What made you come yourself?" he asked, "instead of sending a lawyer?" "I couldn't afford a lawyer until I knew what I was dealing with," she said, "and there was no one else." "No one," he said. He glanced at her sideways, a look that was carefully neutral. "My mother is 62 and her knees are bad," Belle said. "My brother is in Ohio and has 4 children and a farm of his own. My father is dead." She said it without particular weight, just stating the facts. There was no one else. He was quiet for a moment. The wagon moved through the long Nevada afternoon, the sage catching the gold light beautifully, the mountains in the distance sharp and blue. "He would be proud of you," Luke said quietly. "Your father." She looked straight ahead. "I know," she said. And she did know it, and it was both a comfort and an ache. They were nearly back to Dustcreek when she asked him, somewhat against her better judgment, "What happened with the women Rosa told me about?" He was quiet long enough that she thought he might not answer. Then he said, "The first was 5 years ago. A woman named Margaret who came to town to teach school. She was kind and she was lovely and she wanted things I could not give. I knew it from the beginning, but I let it go on anyway because I was selfish." He paused. "She left for Sacramento eventually. I heard she married a good man. I hope she did." "And the second?" Belle asked. "2 years ago, Lydia. A rancher's daughter from Elko. We had an understanding that was not, it turned out, the same understanding. I thought I was honest with her about what I could offer. She thought I meant more than I said." His jaw was tight. "She cried when it ended, and that was the worst thing I had ever caused." Belle considered this for a moment. "So you're not dishonest," she said. "You're incomplete." He looked at her sharply, surprised. "You tell the truth about the surface of things," she continued, "but you keep the inside closed. So people hear what you say and see what you do and assume the inside matches, and it doesn't." He stared at the road ahead for a long moment. "That is the most accurate thing anyone has ever said about me," he said very quietly. "And you've known me for 2 weeks. I'm observant," she said. "I noticed," he said. She told herself that the way he said it was not particularly significant. She told herself that several more times on the ride back and found the argument only moderately convincing. 3 weeks before the hearing, a letter arrived from her mother in Abilene with a bundle of her father's correspondence. 8 letters mentioning the Dustcreek land, describing the land, describing improvements he had made or planned to make, dated across 9 years. It was exactly the kind of evidence they needed. Belle sat in her room at Mrs. Pratt's boarding house that evening and read her father's handwriting for the first time since his death and let herself cry, privately and thoroughly. And then she dried her eyes and sorted the letters into chronological order and added them to the evidence file. The following Thursday, she rode out to the Broken Creek with the letters and found Luke at the barn. She had fallen into a rhythm with these visits that she tried not to examine too closely. She liked arriving here. She liked the way the ranch looked in the morning, the horses in the corral and the creek sound in the background, and the particular quality of peace that the place had, which seemed to emanate from Luke himself, because wherever he was in it, there was this sense of things being in their right order. She showed him the letters and he read them carefully, and she watched his face and saw the moment something in it went a little soft. "He described you in this one," he said, holding up a letter dated 1879. "He says he's planning to build a proper house on the land because his daughter deserves to inherit something beautiful." She pressed her lips together. "He never mentioned that to me," she said. "He was planning something for you," Luke said quietly. He set the letter down on the table between them. "He loved you very much." She looked at the letter. The morning was warm and the barn smelled of hay and horses and the familiar smell of well-used leather. She was aware of the full span of what she was doing here. Not just the land claim, but the whole of it. Her father's dream and her own determination. And this man across the table from her who was beginning to matter in ways she had not planned for and had not, if she was being honest with herself, worked very hard to prevent. She looked up at him and found him already looking at her. "I need to tell you something," she said. "All right," he said. "I came here with a specific intention," she said carefully. "Rosa warned me and I said I would ruin you first, meaning that I would engage with you on my own terms and keep my feet under me and not be the woman who ended up changed by you. And I thought I was doing that." He said nothing, only watched her. "I want to revise my plan somewhat," she said. "How so?" His voice was very quiet. "I still intend to keep my feet under me," she said. "But I think I have been working harder than necessary at not noticing things." "What things?" he asked. She looked at him for a long moment, and something in her chest did something she recognized as terrifying and wonderful in equal measure. "You are not what Rosa described," she said. "Or rather, you are, but you are also more than that. And I think perhaps I am not the kind of person that description applies to." He was very still. "Why not?" "Because I know what I'm looking at," she said. "I know you keep yourself back. I know you are careful about the inside, as I said. And I am not trying to get to the inside. I am not reaching for something I cannot hold." She paused. "I am just here, standing in front of you, telling you the truth, which is that I think about you when you are not here, and that it is inconvenient, and that I am not, in fact, going to ruin you." He stood up from his chair slowly and came around the table and stood in front of her, and she had to look up at him because he was quite a lot taller than her, which she was suddenly much more aware of than before. "I think about you too," he said. His voice had a roughness in it that had not been there before. "Constantly, which is also inconvenient." "We are both inconvenienced," she said. And then he kissed her, which was the least inconvenient thing that had happened to either of them in quite some time. It was a careful kiss, which surprised her. Careful and deliberate and warm, his hand coming up to cup the side of her face with the same gentleness he had with the young bay horse in the corral. And she understood in that moment why women fell for this man, not because he swept you away, but because he paid attention to you in a way that made you feel like the most real thing in the world. When they separated, she took a breath and looked at him and said, "We still have a land hearing in 3 weeks." "We do," he agreed, and she could see him trying not to smile. "So this does not distract from that." "Agreed," he said. "Good," she said, and went back to sorting the letters, which was both entirely practical and made it very hard for either of them to stop smiling for the rest of the morning. What happened next was not planned, but most important things aren't. Harlan Cross apparently had better information than they had assumed, because on a Wednesday afternoon, 10 days before the hearing, Belle returned to Mrs. Pratt's boarding house from the registry office to find that her room had been searched. It was professionally done, nothing obviously disturbed, but she had left a specific arrangement of items on her writing table, and they were not in that arrangement. She checked her satchel, which she had taken with her, and the evidence files, which she kept in 2 places, one in the satchel and one in a small locked box under the loose floorboard that Mrs. Pratt did not know about because Belle had discovered it on her second day and had found it useful. The box was undisturbed. The letters from her mother, the statements from Clara Garza and Pete Merritt, the notes from her conversations with Luke, all intact. What she kept openly on the writing table were copies, made with deliberate inaccuracies. She had been careful about this. She went directly to Rosa's saloon. Rosa listened to her and poured a glass of whiskey for each of them, which Belle drank with more appreciation than she usually allowed herself. "He knows what you're doing," Rosa said. "He wouldn't search your room otherwise." "Good," Belle said. "I want him to know. I want him nervous." Rosa looked at her steadily. "He's also dangerous when he's nervous." "I know," Belle said. "I'm not being careless. I just am not afraid of him." Rosa was quiet for a moment, turning her glass in her hands. "Has Luke told you about the man who disappeared?" she said. "From the disputed land claims?" "No," Belle said. Rosa's expression was careful. "His name was Thomas Reeves. He filed against Cross's competing claim 3 years ago, had a solid case. He left Dustcreek one morning to ride to the registrar in Carson City and never arrived." She paused. "His horse was found outside of town, riderless. Thomas was never found." The whiskey sat heavy in Belle's stomach. "Do you think Cross?" "I think Dustcreek is a small town and Cross has been powerful in it for a long time," Rosa said. "And I think people who challenge him have not always been safe." Belle rode to the Broken Creek the following morning. She told Luke about the search and about Thomas Reeves. He listened with that focused stillness, and when she finished his jaw was very tight. "I knew Thomas," he said. "Not well, but I knew him." "Luke," she said carefully, "I need to know that you are not in a position where helping me puts you in that kind of danger." He looked at her. "Don't," he said quietly. "I mean it." "So do I," he said. "Cross is not going to do to me what he did to Thomas. I'm not alone, I'm known in this county, and I have a ranch that would raise questions if I disappeared. But more importantly, he stopped and looked at her with an expression that was entirely without the careful guardedness she had come to expect from him, an expression that was fully open in a way she suspected he had not allowed himself to be in years. More importantly, I am not going to stand to one side and let you fight this alone. She looked at him for a long moment. Something settled in her chest, something that was not doubt or wariness but its absolute opposite. "All right," she said quietly. "All right," he agreed. He reached across the table and covered her hand with his, and she turned her hand over and held his, and they sat like that in the warm morning kitchen of the Broken Creek for a while, not talking, just being present together in a way that felt like the most natural thing she had encountered in years. She sent an urgent letter to James Ackaffer that afternoon, telling him about the room search and Thomas Reeves, and asking him to expedite the petition for territorial oversight. She also wrote to the territorial sheriff's office in Carson City, laying out the Thomas Reeves situation as plainly and factually as she could. Ackaffer's response came 4 days later. The petition for territorial oversight had been filed. A territorial court representative would attend the local hearing. And Ackaffer himself was making the trip to Dustcreek because he had, in reviewing the files she had sent him, determined that this was a case worth his personal attention. He arrived 5 days before the hearing on a Wednesday stage, a tall black man in his early 40s with a precise manner and an air of absolute competence that Belle recognized and immediately liked. He reviewed all the documents in a single long session at the back table of Rosa's saloon, Rosa bringing coffee periodically with the quiet discretion of someone who understood that the work being done was important. Ackaffer said very little while he read. When he finished, he aligned all the papers neatly and looked up at Belle. "This is a strong case," he said. "The letters from your father are extremely helpful." The pattern of Cross's filings, presented alongside the Garza and Merritt situations, is damning, and the territorial oversight means the local hearing officer cannot simply rule in Cross's favor without review. He paused. "I want to add one thing. I contacted the territorial sheriff's office regarding Thomas Reeves before I left Carson City. They are sending someone." Luke, who was seated to Belle's left, said, "Good." "Mr. Alden," Ackaffer said, looking at him. "Your water rights dispute last year, the documentation from that case, I would like to include it in the pattern evidence if you're willing. It shows Cross's methods extended to your situation as well." "Willing," Luke said immediately. Ackaffer nodded. "Then I believe we are prepared." The hearing was set for a Friday morning at the territorial courthouse, which was a generous title for a whitewashed building off the main street that normally served as a meeting hall. When Belle arrived with Luke and Ackaffer, she found that a substantial portion of Dustcreek had come to observe, including Clara Garza with her oldest child and Pete Merritt, who had arranged transport despite his mobility, and Rosa Gutierrez in her best dress with an expression of quiet fierceness. Harlan Cross arrived with Beaumont and 2 other men. Cross himself looked confident, which Belle had expected, but she also noticed something underneath the confidence. He had not expected Ackaffer. She could see that in the slight recalibration of his expression when he registered the lawyer's presence. The territorial court representative, a thin, careful woman named Mrs. Pierce, who was there to observe and report rather than to adjudicate, sat to one side with a notebook. The local hearing officer, a man named Dolan who Belle had identified as being in Cross's pocket, looked distinctly uncomfortable. The hearing was 4 hours. Ackaffer was extraordinary. He was precise and clear and thorough, and when Cross's lawyer Beaumont attempted to argue that Elias Holloway had not maintained sufficient contact with the land to sustain the claim, Ackaffer produced the letters one by one, reading the relevant passages aloud, and there was a quality to the silence in the room that told Belle the audience was listening and was moved. Her father's words read out in that careful public room about the land he had bought for his daughter's future. And Belle sat straight in her chair and breathed steadily, and did not look anywhere except forward. When Achafor presented the pattern evidence, the 6 claims Cross had filed against vulnerable landowners over 4 years, the 3 separate methodologies, the clear coordination, Cross's composure showed its first real crack. He leaned over to Beaumont and said something in a low voice, and Beaumont's expression did not improve. Dahlen attempted twice to rule on procedural grounds in Cross's favor, and was quietly and firmly corrected both times by Mrs. Pierce, who made notes each time with a precision that clearly made Dahlen very unhappy. The hearing officer ultimately did not rule in Cross's favor. He could not, with the territorial representative present and Achafor's documentation in the record. He announced that the matter was being referred to the territorial court for final determination, which was exactly what they had wanted. Cross stood in the doorway afterward looking at Belle with an expression she could not entirely read. It was not the look of a defeated man exactly. It was the look of a man recalculating. She met his gaze steadily and did not move. He turned and walked away, and Achafor said beside her, "The territorial court will rule within 30 days. Based on what was presented today, I expect the ruling to be in your favor." Belle let out a long, slow breath. "Thank you," she said. "Thank you for preparing an excellent case," Achafor said simply. "The strength was in your evidence." Luke was behind her, and he put his hand at the small of her back, a light, steady pressure, and she leaned into it just slightly. Rosa came across the room and embraced Belle, which surprised her, and then Rosa held her by the shoulders and looked at her. "Your father would be very proud," Rosa said. "I know," Belle said, and this time her voice was not entirely steady, and she did not mind. The weeks that followed the hearing were busy in a different way than the weeks before it. Achafor returned to Carson City to manage the territorial process. The territorial sheriff's deputies had arrived and were making inquiries about Thomas Reeves, which had caused a significant shift in the atmosphere around Harlan Cross. It was becoming clear to Dustcreek that the era of Cross doing as he pleased in the western edges of the county was ending, and the town was in the process of adjusting to that realization, which created a certain energetic uncertainty in the air. Belle found herself less busy than she had been in months, and the absence of the immediate urgent problem created space for something else to occupy, namely the matter of Luke Alden. They spent time together in ways that were not meetings about the land case. He took her out to see the 42 acres on a clear May morning, riding out from town together on the East Road, and then cutting southwest along a dry creek bed, and they stood on the boundary of her father's land and looked at it properly. It was, she thought, not beautiful in the dramatic way of some Nevada landscape. It was quieter than that. Rolling scrub, a line of cottonwoods following the dry creek, the mountains filling the western horizon. But there was something about standing on it, knowing it was hers, knowing her father had walked here and thought of her, that made it feel much larger than 42 acres. "What will you do with it?" Luke asked. They were standing side by side, their horses a little way behind them. "Build something," she said. "I don't know exactly what yet, a house certainly, maybe a garden." She looked at the cottonwood line. "There's water under there, I think. The creek bed suggests a spring." "There is," Luke said. "I know where it surfaces, about a quarter-mile north of where you're standing." She looked at him. He was looking at the land with an expression that she had learned to read now, the honest, unguarded version of him that appeared at certain moments. He looked as though the land meant something to him beyond being useful to her situation. "You like it here," she said. "I do," he said. "I always have." "Your father had a good eye when he chose it." He paused. "He told me once he wanted to watch sunsets from this land. He said the western exposure was perfect for it." She turned to look west. The mountains were lit gold and rose at their peaks in the evening light, and below them the scrubland ran long and quiet and beautiful. "He was right," she said softly. They stood there as the light changed and neither of them spoke, and it was one of those pieces of time that feel complete in themselves, sealed and whole. In the ride back to Dustcreek in the dusk, he told her about his own beginning in Nevada. He had come from Missouri at 22, 6 years ago, with 3 horses and a small amount of cash and the specific stubborn determination to build something that was entirely his own. His father had been a difficult man, a good farmer but cold in a way that had left a particular hollow in Luke, a difficulty with the inside of himself that he had worked around rather than through for most of his adult life. "That's what it was," he said, looking at the road ahead in the falling dark. "With Margaret and with Lydia, it was not that I did not care for them. It was that I did not know how to let them into the part of me that matters. I kept that part for myself because keeping it felt like safety." "And now?" she asked. He was quiet for a long moment, the horses moving steady in the dusk, the first stars beginning to show in the eastern sky. "It doesn't feel like safety anymore," he said. "It just feels like being alone in a room with the door locked from the inside." She considered that. "You've been unlocking it," she said, "bit by bit, in the conversations we've had." "I know," he said. "I noticed." She reached out in the dark and found his hand on the reins and covered it with hers briefly, just for a moment, and then drew her hand back. He did not say anything, but she felt him exhale. They reached Dustcreek in the last of the light, and he walked her to Mrs. Pratt's boarding house gate, and they stood in the evening with the town sounds around them, boots on the wooden sidewalks and a piano from the red spur, and somewhere a dog having an opinion about something. "Belle," he said. "Yes," she said. "I don't know with certainty what I am capable of being," he said, with a careful honesty that she found more moving than eloquence. "But I know that what I want to be is the kind of man that deserves your time, and I am working at it." She looked at him in the last light. "I think you already are," she said. "The working at it is part of it." He smiled then, a real smile that transformed his face entirely, and she thought that was the most beautiful thing she had seen in quite some time. The territorial court ruling came 26 days after the hearing, by way of a letter delivered to Acafer and forwarded to Belle by telegraph. Elias Holloway's land claim was affirmed. Belle Holloway was the legal owner of 42 acres on the western edge of Dustcreek, Nevada, free and clear. The competing claim by Harlan Cross was dismissed with prejudice. 2 days later, the territorial sheriff's deputies announced that Harlan Cross was being held for questioning in connection with the disappearance of Thomas Reeves, based on testimony from one of Cross's former employees who had apparently decided that his loyalty to a man under federal scrutiny was less compelling than it had once seemed. This was not yet a conclusion, but it was a beginning of one, and Dustcreek felt it in the way a town feels when a pressure it has been living under for years suddenly, unexpectedly, eases. Clara Garza's land claim was affirmed the following month. Pete Merritt's came through in July. The pattern evidence that Acafer had presented proved decisive. Belle stood in her kitchen at Mrs. Pratt's the evening the telegram about the ruling arrived and held it in both hands and felt the particular quality of a thing that has been fought for and won. It was better than being given something. It was altogether different. She thought about her father, and she thought about the western-facing land with the cottonwood line and the mountains going gold at sunset, and she knew exactly what she was going to do next. She was going to build a house. She told Luke on Sunday, riding out to the broken creek in the warm June morning. He was at the corral again, this time with a different young horse, a gray one, and he came to the fence when he saw her with that particular quality of gladness that she had noticed appearing on his face when she arrived, which she liked more than she planned to admit. She told him the ruling and watched him react to it with the warm, uncomplicated happiness of a person who genuinely wanted good things for someone else. He said, "Congratulations, Belle," in a voice that was low and warm, and she felt it all the way through. "I want to build a house on the land," she said. "Start soon, before summer ends." "I'll help," he said immediately. "You don't need to." "I know I don't need to," he said. "I want to." She looked at him. The June morning was extravagant around them, the sage blooming faint purple, the mountains clean and close. "Luke," she said, "Yes," he said. "When you said you were working at being the kind of man that deserves my time," she said carefully. "What did you mean in terms of future? What were you describing?" He held her gaze steadily. She admired that he didn't look away from direct questions. "I meant everything," he said. "If you'll have that from me." "Everything is a large word," she said. "I know what I mean by it," he said. "I mean I want you here. I mean I want to know you for the rest of my life. I mean that the room with the door locked from the inside is open now, and what is in it is, it turns out, mostly you." He stopped and she could see him working through his own words, testing them. "I mean that I love you, and I am aware that is a fast thing to say and a slow thing to mean, and I mean it slowly." She stood very still and felt something immense and warm and clean move through her. "I love you too," she said. "I have been meaning it for a while and arguing with myself about it." "Did you win the argument?" he asked, and there was a smile starting at the corner of his mouth. "Obviously not," she said. He stepped forward and took her face in his hands and kissed her there in the morning sunlight in the yard of the broken creek. And it was different from the first time in the barn, less careful and more certain. And she wrapped her hands in the front of his shirt and held on, and it was the best feeling she had encountered in her 24 years on this earth. The house on the 42 acres was not built in a summer. It was built across a summer and an autumn, with Luke doing the heavier labor and Belle making most of the decisions about what went where and why, which was a division of effort that suited them both extremely well. Rose's husband, a carpenter named Eduardo, who had been quietly part of Rose's life for 20 years in the way that solid people in good partnerships become part of each other's landscape, contributed 2 weeks of skilled work to the framing. James Ockafer, making a return visit to Dustcreek to close out the last legal details of the cross situation, came to see the progress on the house and stood in the framed but not yet walled structure and said, "This is going to be very good," and Belle believed him. She and Luke had fallen into an easiness together that she had not previously believed was possible in a romantic relationship, because all the romantic relationships she had observed had involved either enormous effort or enormous pretending. This involved neither. He was himself and she was herself, and they were genuinely better together than separately, and this turned out to be enough. More than enough. It was the specific foundation thing that other relationships were sometimes trying to imitate. He asked her to marry him on an October afternoon on the land, standing in front of the house that was by then walled and roofed but not yet finished inside, the late afternoon light doing the thing it did with the mountains behind them. He did it simply and directly in the way he did things, without a grand speech, just turning to look at her and saying, "Belle, will you marry me?" She said, "Yes, obviously yes." He laughed, which was a sound she had come to love enormously, warm and real and unguarded. They were married in November in Dustcreek, at the church with the quieter pastor, which was Mrs. Pratt's recommendation and turned out to be accurate. Rosa stood beside Belle and Eduardo stood beside Luke, and half of Dustcreek came because the whole story of Belle Holloway arriving on the stage with her Winchester and her land deed, and taking on Harlan Cross and winning, had become one of the better stories the town told about itself. Pete Merritt, who had made a point of attending, sat in the front row and wept openly through the vows, which he later explained was because he was happy, and also because at 70 years old, he had earned the right to cry at whatever he felt like. Belle moved into the broken creek after the wedding while the house on the 42 acres was being finished, and she found that she loved the broken creek too, the white-painted house and the horses in the corral and the creek sound, and the particular quality of peace the place had. She kept her work separate from the domestic, continuing the meticulous records she had built during the land case, beginning to build a broader file of territorial land rights issues, because she had discovered, in fighting her own case, that she was very good at this kind of work, and that there was a significant need for it. Ockafer wrote to her in December suggesting she consider studying law. This was not an absurd suggestion in 1882, though it was not common and was not easy for a woman, and she put the letter in a box and thought about it seriously and did not close the door on it. Luke knew about the letter because she told him everything now, which was still sometimes surprising to her, how completely she had stopped editing herself around him. He said, "Do it," without hesitation. And when she pointed out that it would require travel and time and resources, he said, "We will sort the travel and the time and the resources," and said it with the calm certainty of a man who had entirely revised his understanding of what he was capable of committing to. The news that she was carrying their first child came in the spring of 1883, early March, when the Broken Creek Ranch was entering the best season of the year, and the Nevada hills were as close to green as they ever got. She told Luke in the kitchen on an evening when he was already in a good humor from a successful day's work, and she watched his face go through a sequence of expressions that ended somewhere in the vicinity of pure undisguised wonder. "A baby," he said. "Yes," she said. He sat down heavily in his chair and then immediately stood up again, which made her laugh. He came to her and took her hands and looked at her face as though he were looking at something that confirmed every good thing he had ever tentatively hoped might be true. "Are you glad?" she asked, though she could see the answer. "I am terrified," he said honestly, "and I am the happiest I have ever been in my life, and those two things are both true at the same time." "That seems right," she said. He put his arms around her carefully, as though she had suddenly become breakable, and she pressed her face against his chest and felt his heart going faster than usual. "You're not going to treat me as if I'm made of glass," she said against his shirt. "No," he agreed and held her closer. The house on the 42 acres was completed in April 1883, which meant that it was ready just in time to be entirely irrelevant as a primary residence, because by that point neither of them could imagine leaving the Broken Creek, where they had built themselves into each other's lives so completely. They decided to use the 42-acre house for something else, and after various discussions settled on the idea of offering it as a residence for women who arrived in Dustcreek in circumstances like Belle's had been, needing a place to be while they got their footing. This was not a formal arrangement at first, but over the following year it became one. The first woman to use it was Clara Garza, whose husband's mining work had taken him further east and left her briefly without accommodation, and she lived there for 3 months while she sorted a longer-term arrangement, and she brought her children and her particular warm, fierce energy, and the house felt lived in immediately, which was exactly what it needed. The baby was born in October 1883, the same month as Belle and Luke's first wedding anniversary, which she considered a nicely efficient coincidence. It was a boy, long and healthy, with Luke's gray eyes and her tendency to express opinions loudly from the first day. They named him Elias, and the specific quality of Luke's face when he first held his son was the most profound thing Belle had ever seen. All of the careful guardedness, all of that long habit of keeping the door locked, was entirely absent. He held that baby with the whole of himself, open and unprotected and incandescently present. "He's extraordinary," Luke said, which Belle thought was an accurate assessment for a person who was 48 hours old. "He has your eyes," she said. "He has your expression," Luke said, "that look of having a very strong opinion about something." "He gets it from both of us," she said. He looked up from the baby to her, and his smile was the one that transformed his face, warm and completely real. Rosa came to see them on the 3rd day and held Elias with the practiced comfort of someone who had held many babies and thought this one was particularly good. She looked from the baby to Luke to Belle and back again, and her expression was one of profound satisfaction. "What?" Belle asked. "Nothing," Rosa said. "Only that I was right." "About what?" Belle asked, though she suspected she knew. "About you," Rosa said simply. "When you walked into the Red Spur with your satchel and your rifle, and your jaw set that particular way, I thought, this is the woman who will figure him out." "I told her I was going to ruin him first," Belle reminded her. "Yes," Rosa said, looking at Luke, who was watching this exchange with amiable patience. "How did that go for you?" "Very well," Belle said, and looked at her husband and her son, and the house they had built together and the 40 acres of Nevada scrub that was hers and her father's memory and her future all braided together. And she thought that ruin had never looked quite so much like everything she had ever wanted. Luke caught her eye across the room and raised an eyebrow in the small private language they had built over months of knowing each other, asking without words if she was all right, and she answered the same way. A slight lift at the corner of her mouth that meant more than all right, that meant exactly right, and he smiled back with the whole of himself, nothing held back, nothing locked away. Harlan Cross was formally charged by the territorial court in the spring of 1884 in connection with the disappearance of Thomas Reeves and additionally with coordinated fraud in the land filing system. The trial, which took place in Carson City, lasted 2 weeks. Belle attended as a witness and gave her testimony in a clear, steady voice that Okafor later told her was one of the finest pieces of witness testimony he had observed. Precise and factual and entirely unintimidated by Beaumont's attempts at cross-examination. Cross was convicted on the fraud charges. The Reeves matter resulted in a separate conviction that carried a heavier sentence. He would not be returning to Dustcreek in any capacity that mattered. James Okafor shook Belle's hand outside the Carson City courthouse and said that if she was serious about the law, he would take her as a student in a correspondence program that he was involved in establishing through the Territorial University. She said she was serious. She had been serious since December 1882 when he first suggested it. She began the correspondence study in the summer of 1884, working on legal texts and case material in the evenings after Elias was asleep. Luke often at the same table, reading one of the worn books from the shelf by the Broken Creek fireplace, and there was something about those evenings that she would hold as one of the images of what happiness looked like. The lamp on the table and the book in his hand and the papers in hers and the sound of the baby breathing in the next room and the creek outside and the mountains dark against the starlit Nevada sky. "You're going to be a good lawyer," Luke told her one of those evenings. "You don't know that yet," she said. "I know you," he said. "Same thing." She threw a pencil at him. He caught it. The second child came in the summer of 1885, a girl they named Maria after Luke's late mother, with Belle's coloring and Luke's steadiness and an extremely settled personality that contrasted with her brother's vigorous opinions in ways that were occasionally useful and frequently funny. Elias, at not quite 2, regarded his sister with the cautious interest of someone presented with something entirely new to form an opinion about, which took him approximately 3 days before he decided she was excellent. By 1885, Dustcreek had changed considerably. The mining boom had brought enough new people to support a proper school and a doctor's office and a second telegraph line, and the western edge of town, which had been Cross's particular domain, had opened up into a series of small homesteads and farms tended by people who were there legitimately, without the shadow of his manipulation over them. Clara Garza had established herself on her own land with a kitchen garden of remarkable productivity and a reputation for excellent advice on everything from crop rotation to marital disagreements. Pete Merritt was still alive at 72 and opinionated about it. The house on Belle's 42 acres, which had become known quietly among certain women as a stopping place, had been through half a dozen temporary residents by 1885, each one a different story, and Belle had helped several of them navigate land or inheritance disputes in the informal capacity of someone who knew how things worked and who to talk to. Okafor told her that several of those cases, if formalized, would constitute legitimate legal work, and that she should start charging for it. "People respect what they pay for," he said. She thought about that and decided he was right and began charging fair fees, and the work became real in a new way. Luke expanded the Broken Creek cattle operation in 1885 with a partnership with a neighbor, A man named Samuel Torres, whose family had ranched in the territory for 2 generations, and who had the deep knowledge of the land that comes from having grown up within it. The Torres family had navigated the territory with the particular resilience of people who had no choice but to be resilient, and Samuel and Luke had a partnership based on mutual respect and complementary knowledge that worked considerably better than most business arrangements Belle had observed. The Broken Creek in 1885 was a different kind of place than it had been when Belle first rode up the East Road in the spring of 1882. It was bigger in the physical sense, more buildings and more cattle and more working hands, but it was bigger in the other sense too. It held more life. Children's boots by the door and a kitchen that smelled of bread because Belle had discovered that she liked baking in the meditative way of something that does not require intellectual effort and produces immediate satisfying results. Luke's books had been joined by her own growing collection of legal texts and novels. There was a flower bed below the front window that she had planted the previous spring, and that had performed beyond expectations. She stood on the porch of the Broken Creek one evening in late September 1885, the air gone cool and the stars beginning. Elia's asleep and Maria settled after her evening feed, Luke at the corral closing up for the night, and she looked at the western sky where the mountains were dark against the last light, and thought about the girl who had stepped off the stagecoach 3.5 years ago with a rifle and a deed in her boot, and a jaw set against the world. She thought about Rose's warning and her own bold answer to it. "I mean to ruin him first," which she had meant as a declaration of self-preservation, and which had turned out to be the wrong frame entirely. Because you could not ruin someone who was not trying to diminish you. And Luke Alden, for all his careful guardedness in the beginning, had never once tried to make her smaller. He had done the opposite, in fact. He had looked at her with that full gray-eyed attention and seen exactly what was there and found it worthy of his complete regard, and she had done the same for him. And between the two of them, they had built something that was sturdy in the way only real things are. He came up behind her on the porch and put his arms around her from behind, his chin at her temple, and they looked at the mountains together in the last light. "Good day," he asked. "Good day," she said. "I finished the Garza case notes. They're going to win." "I know," he said, "and Maria only cried for 20 minutes this afternoon, which is an improvement." "She has opinions," he said. "She gets it from both of us," Belle said, echoing her own words from 2 years ago, and she felt him laugh against her hair. "Elias asked me today whether stars were alive," he said. "I told him I didn't know for certain. He said he thought they probably were because they seemed happy." She smiled. "He gets the philosophical tendency from you. He gets the confidence from you," Luke said. She turned in his arms and looked up at him in the last light, this man who had been a warning and had become a life, who had been described as dangerous and turned out to be the safest person she had ever known. Not safe in the way of simple or without complication, but safe in the way that matters, which is that he was always fully there. "I need to tell you something," she said. "All right," he said, and his voice was warm and attentive. "The third one is coming," she said, watching his face. He went still for a moment, and then that smile started, the one that transformed him. "When?" he asked. "Spring," she said. He held her close, and she pressed her face against his chest and felt his heart, steady and a little fast, the same as it had been the first time she told him. "I love you," he said into her hair. "I have been meaning it for a long time, and I mean it more every day." "I know," she said. "I do too." Above them the stars were coming out fully now, the vast Nevada sky dense with them, and below the mountains were dark and the sage was quiet, and the creek was moving in its channel, and the horses in the corral were still for the night, and the Broken Creek was lit in its windows with the gold warmth of oil lamps, and it was hers, and it was his, and it was theirs, built from stubbornness and truth, and the specific courage of two people who had looked at each other directly and chosen not to look away. The spring of 1886 brought another boy, whom they named Elias James. James for Okafor, who was godfather in the informal way of someone who has earned the title by being consistently present and useful and good. and the older Elias insisted his brother be called James to avoid confusion, which was the most practical solution anyone offered, and so James he was. Akaffer was at the Broken Creek for the occasion, and sat with Belle when she was recovered enough to sit at the kitchen table. And they talked law for 2 hours while Luke took both older children to see the new foal in the corral, which they could hear through the window, demanding an accounting of itself from the world. "Ready," Akaffer said, "for real practice." "I know," she said. "Dustcreek needs someone," he said. "The territorial court has a recommendation process for formal admission. I can support your application." "I know that too," she said, smiling. "You were ready to hear it," he said. "I was waiting to say yes with both hands free," she said, looking toward the window where she could hear Luke's voice and Elia's questions and Maria's particular carrying tone. He followed her gaze and said nothing for a moment. "He changed," Akaffer said, "from what I observed that first visit." "He did," she said. "And so did I, for the better?" he asked, though he clearly knew the answer. "Entirely," she said. She was admitted to practice in the territory of Nevada in the autumn of 1887, one of the first women to achieve this in the territory. She practiced out of Dustcreek, in a small office on the main street, and her practice was not large, but it was consistent, and it was always the kind of work that mattered: land rights and inheritance cases, and the particular legal situations of people who had no one else to advocate for them. Rosa sent her clients, and Pete Merritt told everyone he met that she was the finest legal mind in 3 counties, which was generous and probably not accurate, but Pete Merritt, at 74, had earned the right to his enthusiasms. On the evening of her first official day of practice, she came home to the Broken Creek and found that Luke had cleaned the house and cooked dinner and bought a bottle of good wine from the Red Spur, which he had placed on the table with a precision that suggested he had thought about the presentation. And when she walked through the door, he was standing in the kitchen, and he looked at her with a pride so open and clean it was almost painful. "Well," he said. "I did it," she said. "I know you did," he said. "Come here." She crossed the kitchen, and he held her, and the children were around their feet making noise, and the house was warm and full of everything that mattered. And she pressed her face against the side of his neck and breathed and felt the whole of her life. The Abilene girl on the stage with her rifle and her deed. The woman who had squared her jaw and walked into the Red Spur and heard a warning and answered it with a declaration. The woman who had fallen in love slowly and certainly, and without losing herself. The lawyer. The mother, the wife, the person she had become in this country under these stars. Rosa said once, much later, when she was telling the story to someone who had not heard it, that Belle Holloway had come to Dustcreek with a warning ringing in her ears about a man who ruined women, and that Belle had said she would ruin him first, and that neither of those things had happened in the way anyone expected. What happened instead? The someone asked. Rosa considered this with her thoughtful, experienced expression. "They rebuilt each other," she said. "Which is altogether different and considerably better," and it was. It was the truest thing that could be said about the spring of 1882, and the woman with the rifle and the deed and the jaw set against the world, and the man at the fence with the rope and the careful guarded heart, and the years that followed, and the children's boots by the door, and the mountains going gold at evening, and the particular quality of a life built on truth and stubbornness, and the specific brave act of looking at another person and choosing, every day, to keep looking. Belle Holloway had come west to claim what was hers, and she had done exactly that. She had claimed every bit of it, the land and the work and the love and the life. And she had not been ruined by any of it, and neither had he. And if the warning Rosa had given that first Tuesday afternoon in the Red Spur had served any purpose in the end, it was only this. It had told Belle exactly who she was dealing with, and she had walked forward anyway, with her eyes fully open, which was the only way she had ever known how to walk toward anything worth having.